The world around you is changing faster than most people are willing to admit. Not slowly, not quietly, but with a force so aggressive, so coordinated, and so spiritually destructive that many people can feel something is wrong without being able to explain why. Families are collapsing. Anxiety is everywhere. Children are growing up confused about reality itself. Faith is disappearing from entire nations in a single generation. And while most people explain these things as politics, culture, economics, or psychology, there are some within the church who believe something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. Something spiritual, something ancient, something the modern world no longer wants to acknowledge. Because once you admit the spiritual battle is real, everything changes. Suddenly the crisis in the family looks different. The collapse of morality looks different. The attacks on innocence, truth, identity, and faith no longer appear random. They begin to form a pattern. And according to many priests who have spent years confronting the darkest spiritual realities imaginable, this pattern is becoming impossible to ignore. What you are about to hear is not entertainment. It is not superstition. It is not another internet conspiracy designed to create fear and outrage. It is a warning rooted in theology, pastoral experience, and a view of reality that Christianity has taught for centuries, but modern society has almost completely forgotten. Because there are things happening right now that most Catholics, including practicing Catholics, are dangerously unprepared for. And the frightening part is not simply that evil exists. The frightening part is how comfortable people have become living beside it, without resistance, without awareness, and without spiritual protection. For decades, priests involved in spiritual warfare ministry and exorcism have quietly described a dramatic shift in what they are witnessing, not just more confusion, not simply more unbelief, but an increase in darkness that feels more aggressive, more open, and more destructive than in previous generations. Many of these priests insist that what once remained hidden has now become normalized. Practices that previous generations instinctively avoided are now marketed as harmless entertainment or self-discovery. Children are exposed to occult symbolism before they even understand what it means. Spiritual practices disconnected from Christianity are promoted as tools for healing, empowerment, and enlightenment. Entire generations are growing up with little understanding of sin, grace, confession, sacrifice, or the supernatural reality of good and evil. And because they have been taught to believe only in the material world, many walk directly into spiritual dangers without recognizing them. The irony is devastating. People claim they do not believe in spiritual warfare, yet they participate in behaviors that previous Christian civilizations would have immediately recognized as secretly dangerous. Meditation practices centered on emptying the mind, obsession with crystals and energy manipulation, fascination with tarot cards, occult rituals disguised as entertainment, and the search for mystical experiences outside God have become normal parts of modern culture. And according to many experienced exorcists, the consequences are no longer rare. They are becoming common. What makes this even more alarming is the claim that the church itself has weakened in its ability to confront these realities. There was a time when priests were trained to understand spiritual warfare clearly and seriously. The devil was not treated as a symbol or psychological metaphor. Sin was spoken about directly. Hell was preached without embarrassment. The sacraments were understood as spiritual weapons, not symbolic traditions. But over time, especially in many parts of the Western world, that certainty began to fade. In many seminaries and theological institutions, supernatural realities were reduced to abstract concepts. Demonic activity became something embarrassing to discuss openly. Spiritual warfare was treated as outdated language from a less educated age. And while society moved further into confusion and moral collapse, many churches responded not with clarity and courage, but with silence. The result, according to traditional Catholic thinkers, is a generation spiritually exposed and almost entirely unprepared for serious combat against evil. The crisis becomes even clearer when you look at the collapse of sacramental life. For centuries, Catholics understood that the sacraments were not optional religious customs. They were the very channels through which God communicates supernatural grace to human souls. Baptism was understood as liberation from original sin. Confession restored grace lost through mortal sin. The Eucharist was believed to be the literal body and blood of Christ, strengthening the soul against darkness. Marriage was a sacred covenant reflecting divine order. These realities formed the spiritual structure of Christian civilization. But now millions who still identify as Catholic rarely confess their sins, barely attend Mass, and live disconnected from the sacramental life entirely. In practical terms, many priests argue that people have removed themselves from the very protections designed to strengthen the soul against evil. The consequences are not merely emotional or cultural, they are spiritual. And if the soul truly exists, then neglecting it carries consequences far more serious than most modern people realize. The attack on the family is perhaps where this battle becomes most visible. Traditional Catholic theology has always viewed the family as more than a social arrangement. The family is seen as the foundation of civilization and the first place where children encounter love, truth, sacrifice, discipline, and God. It is where faith is transmitted from one generation to the next. Destroy the family, and eventually you weaken the church itself. According to many traditional Catholic voices, that destruction did not happen accidentally. First, sex was separated from procreation. Then marriage was separated from permanence. Divorce became normalized. Fatherhood weakened. Children increasingly grew up without stable homes, spiritual formation, or moral guidance. And once the family structure fractured, children became easier to influence through media, politics, entertainment, and ideology. Many priests working in pastoral ministry insist that one of the most common elements in severe spiritual and emotional dysfunction is the absence of a strong father figure. A child's understanding of authority, protection, and even God himself is often shaped by the father. When that image is broken, distorted, absent, or abusive, deep wounds are created. Wounded souls become vulnerable souls. At the same time, society began aggressively targeting children at younger and younger ages. Confusion about identity, morality, sexuality, and truth itself entered classrooms, entertainment, and digital culture. Young people searching for meaning found themselves disconnected from tradition, disconnected from transcendence, and disconnected from stable moral foundations. But the human soul cannot live without searching for something greater than itself. If people do not find transcendence in God, they will search for it somewhere else. That is why many young people drift toward occult practices, spiritual experimentation, radical ideologies, or extreme forms of self-expression. Not necessarily because they are evil, but because they are hungry. Hungry for mystery, hungry for truth, hungry for something real in a world that increasingly feels empty and artificial. And according to many priests, the tragedy is that the church often failed to answer that hunger. Instead of offering depth, sacrifice, reverence, and supernatural conviction, many communities reduced faith to self-help language, social gatherings, and vague messages about positivity. Young people searching for transcendence eventually looked elsewhere, and many found darkness waiting for them there. One of the most disturbing claims made by experienced exorcists is that demonic influence rarely begins dramatically. It usually begins quietly, through temptation, through repeated sin, through addiction, through despair, through obsession, through hatred, pride, lust, bitterness, and isolation. Spiritual attacks often disguise themselves as normal thoughts and emotions. The enemy does not appear with horns and fire announcing his presence. According to traditional Catholic teaching, evil works through deception. It studies weakness. It exploits wounds. It slowly normalizes destruction until the soul no longer recognizes what is happening. That is why spiritual warfare is described not as fantasy, but as daily reality. Every temptation toward despair, impurity, hatred, or hopelessness becomes part of a larger battle over the direction of the soul. And in this worldview, modern culture has become extremely effective at feeding those weaknesses continuously. Yet, despite the darkness, there remains a message of hope running through all of this. Because Christianity has never taught that evil wins. Every period of crisis throughout church history eventually produced saints, martyrs, reformers, and renewal. The Roman Empire collapsed. Heresies spread across nations. Corrupt leaders rose within the church itself. Entire civilizations turned away from God. Yet Christianity survived every assault against it for 2,000 years. According to believers, this endurance is not accidental. It is evidence that the church exists not merely as a human institution, but as something sustained by divine promise. And even now, many priests claim they are seeing signs of renewal hidden beneath the chaos. Young men entering the priesthood with seriousness and conviction. Families returning to reverent sacramental life. converts discovering Christianity through genuine intellectual and spiritual searching, small communities forming around prayer, truth, and tradition, a remnant quietly rebuilding while much of the world continues drifting into confusion. But the warning remains urgent, because no civilization remains stable forever once it abandons truth completely. Every society eventually reaches a moment when the consequences of moral and spiritual collapse can no longer be hidden. And many traditional Catholic thinkers believe the modern West is approaching that moment rapidly, not necessarily through dramatic apocalyptic imagery, but through spiritual exhaustion, social fragmentation, loneliness, addiction, confusion, and the slow collapse of meaning itself. The solution, they argue, is not panic. It is conversion, serious conversion, returning to prayer, returning to confession, returning to the sacraments, rebuilding families, teaching children clearly, rejecting occult influences, developing discipline, learning the faith deeply instead of treating religion as a cultural accessory. Because according to Christianity, neutrality in spiritual warfare does not exist. Every soul moves either toward God or away from Him. Every decision shapes the heart over time. And perhaps that is the real challenge hidden beneath everything you have just heard. Not fear, not sensationalism, but choice. The choice between distraction and truth, between comfort and discipline, between spiritual numbness and spiritual awakening. Christianity teaches that history is ultimately a battle between light and darkness, truth and deception, grace and rebellion. The modern world may laugh at that idea. It may dismiss it as primitive or irrational, but many who have witnessed the collapse of souls up close no longer see it as symbolic language. They see it as reality. And they believe the time for passive faith is over. Because if evil is real, then spiritual preparation matters. If the soul is real, then eternity matters. And if Christ truly conquered death, then no darkness, no matter how powerful it appears, will ever have the final word. There is another reality most people never stop to consider. Civilizations do not collapse overnight. They decay slowly, almost invisibly at first, until eventually the foundation underneath disappears, and everyone suddenly wonders how everything fell apart so quickly. History repeats this pattern over and over again. Nations become wealthy, comfortable, distracted, and convinced they no longer need God. Morality becomes negotiable. Truth becomes subjective. Pleasure becomes the highest good. Sacrifice becomes meaningless. And eventually an entire culture loses the ability to recognize what is sacred. That is where many believe the modern world stands right now. Not simply in political confusion or cultural disagreement, but in a profound spiritual crisis, unlike anything seen in generations. And the frightening part is how normal it all feels. People have adapted to chaos. They have adapted to isolation, addiction, broken families, constant anxiety, moral confusion, and spiritual emptiness, as though these things are ordinary features of human life. But according to traditional Christian thought, they are not ordinary at all. They are symptoms of a civilization slowly disconnecting itself from the source of truth, meaning, and grace. Many priests who work closely in spiritual ministries insist that modern people drastically underestimate the reality of evil because they misunderstand how evil actually works. Most imagine evil as something obvious and dramatic, something immediately recognizable. But historically, Christianity has taught the opposite. Evil succeeds precisely because it disguises itself as freedom, empowerment, comfort, entertainment, or enlightenment. Rarely does darkness announce itself openly in the beginning. Instead, it slowly shifts the boundaries of what people accept. A society once shocked by certain behaviors gradually learns to celebrate them. Sins once recognized immediately as destructive become defended as personal rights. Things considered spiritually dangerous for centuries suddenly become harmless trends. And little by little, people lose the ability to distinguish between what elevates the soul and what destroys it. This process rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. That is why so many people remain spiritually asleep, even as the collapse unfolds around them. One of the clearest examples is the growing obsession with self-created spirituality disconnected from God. Modern culture constantly encourages people to find their own truth, manifest their reality, or discover the divine within themselves. At first, these ideas sound harmless, even uplifting. But many traditional Catholic theologians warn that this mindset quietly removes God from the center of spiritual life and replaces him with the self. Instead of surrendering to truth, People begin constructing their own version of truth. Instead of worshiping God, they begin worshiping personal desire, emotion, identity, and experience. And once the self becomes the highest authority, every moral boundary eventually collapses. Christianity has always taught that freedom without truth becomes slavery. A person who follows every impulse eventually becomes controlled by those impulses. Addiction, lust, pride, greed, anger, despair, and narcissism slowly take over the soul until the person no longer knows how to live without them. This spiritual confusion becomes even more dangerous when combined with modern technology. Never in human history have people been exposed to so much constant noise, temptation, distraction, and psychological manipulation every waking hour of the day. Phones, social media, streaming entertainment, endless digital stimulation, pornography, algorithm-driven outrage, and virtual identity formation now shape human consciousness from childhood onward. Many priests argue that modern technology has become one of the greatest instruments of spiritual distraction ever created. Not because technology itself is evil, but because it trains the human mind to remain constantly restless. Silence disappears, reflection disappears, prayer becomes difficult. Attention spans collapse. People lose the ability to think deeply or remain spiritually attentive because their minds are constantly flooded with stimulation. And according to countless saints throughout Christian history, silence is essential for hearing God. The devil fears silence because silence allows the soul to confront truth. Noise keeps people distracted enough to avoid confronting themselves. This is especially devastating for children. Previous generations at least encountered the world slowly. Moral corruption existed, but it was not delivered directly into a child's pocket 24 hours a day. Today, children are exposed to violence, pornography, occult imagery, ideological conditioning, and spiritual confusion before they are emotionally capable of processing any of it. Many parents have unknowingly surrendered the formation of their children entirely to digital culture. And once that happens, the family begins losing its role as the primary place of moral and spiritual formation. Children increasingly learn about identity, relationships, morality, sexuality, and purpose, not from parents, priests, or faith communities, but from influencers, corporations, entertainment media, and online subcultures. The consequences are becoming visible everywhere. Depression, loneliness, anxiety, self-hatred, addiction, and confusion are exploding among young people at historically unprecedented levels. Yet despite all the technological progress of modern civilization, millions feel more empty than ever before. According to many experienced spiritual directors, one of the greatest lies of modern culture is the belief that human beings can survive spiritually without sacrifice. Every advertisement, every algorithm, every entertainment platform trains people to avoid discomfort at all costs. Immediate pleasure becomes the solution to every problem. Sadness must be medicated instantly. Boredom must be eliminated instantly. Desire must be satisfied instantly. But Christianity teaches something radically different. It teaches that suffering, when united to God, can purify the soul. It teaches that discipline creates freedom. It teaches that sacrifice strengthens the human person. And this message directly contradicts the modern obsession with comfort. Many people today have never developed spiritual endurance because they have been conditioned to escape every form of hardship immediately. But spiritual warfare requires endurance. It requires discipline. It requires the ability to resist temptation even when resistance is painful. And according to many traditional Catholic voices, this is precisely why modern souls have become so vulnerable. They have lost the habit of spiritual resistance. The saints understood this deeply. Nearly every saint throughout Christian histories spoke about spiritual combat as a daily reality. They fasted. They prayed for hours. They disciplined their bodies. They confessed regularly. They meditated constantly on death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Modern society often views this as extreme or unhealthy, but the saints believed they were preparing for eternity. They understood life as temporary and the soul as eternal. And because they took eternity seriously, they approached spiritual life with seriousness. Compare that mindset to modern Christianity in many places today, where religion is often reduced to motivation, comfort, and emotional reassurance. Many churches avoid difficult truths because they fear offending people. Sin is rarely preached clearly. Repentance sounds old-fashioned. The cross becomes symbolic instead of transformative. Yet Christianity was never meant to be comfortable. Christ himself warned repeatedly that following him would require sacrifice, persecution, and radical conversion. He never promised ease. He promised truth. Another reason many priests believe spiritual darkness is intensifying is because modern civilization increasingly denies objective truth altogether. Everything becomes relative. Morality becomes personal preference. Even biological reality becomes negotiable. Once a society abandons the idea that truth exists outside individual desire, chaos inevitably follows. Because without objective truth, power becomes the only remaining authority. Whoever controls education, entertainment, politics, media, and technology begins shaping reality itself for millions of people. This is why many traditional Christians believe modern society is not simply experiencing moral disagreement, but a deeper rebellion against the very idea of divine order. The rejection of God eventually leads to the rejection of human nature itself. And when people lose any stable understanding of who they are, they become easier to manipulate, easier to isolate, and easier to control. Yet in the middle of all this darkness, Christianity continues insisting on something extraordinary. No soul is beyond redemption. No matter how broken a person becomes, grace remains available. This is why the sacrament of confession remains so central in Catholic teaching. Confession is not merely emotional relief or religious therapy. It is understood as a supernatural restoration of the soul. According to Catholic theology, mortal sin severs sanctifying grace within the soul. Confession restores it. That is why saints throughout history treated confession with extreme seriousness. They understood that sin was not merely rule-breaking. Sin damaged the relationship between the soul and God. And modern society's refusal to acknowledge sin at all has left many people spiritually wounded without understanding why they feel empty, restless, or trapped. The same is true of the Eucharist, which Catholicism teaches is not symbolic, but the real presence of Christ himself. For traditional Catholics, the Eucharist is the center of reality. It is the place where heaven touches earth. It is spiritual nourishment stronger than any darkness in the world. That is why so many saints spent hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. They believed they were literally sitting before the presence of God. And according to many exorcists, demonic forces react violently to the Eucharist precisely because it represents the direct presence of Christ. In this worldview, the sacraments are not rituals invented by human beings. They are spiritual realities carrying divine power into human lives, which means abandoning them has consequences far deeper than most people imagine. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of modern civilization is not that people openly hate God. It is that many have simply become spiritually numb. Indifference has replaced rebellion. Endless entertainment has replaced reflection. People no longer ask eternal questions because they are too distracted to think about them. And according to many priests, spiritual numbness may be more dangerous than open hostility because numb souls rarely seek help. They continue drifting further from God while convincing themselves everything is fine. But Christianity warns repeatedly that every human life moves toward judgment, whether people acknowledge it or not. Death remains unavoidable. Eternity remains unavoidable. And every soul eventually confronts the truth. That is why so many traditional Catholic voices are now calling for urgency. Not panic, not paranoia, but urgency. They argue that modern Christians can no longer survive on shallow faith, occasional prayer, or cultural identity alone. The times demand seriousness. Families must rebuild prayer inside the home. Parents must take responsibility for forming their children spiritually instead of outsourcing it entirely to institutions. Men must reclaim spiritual leadership within their families. Communities rooted in truth must form before deeper crises arrive. And individual believers must stop treating spiritual life as an optional hobby and begin treating it as preparation for eternity. Because in the end, the battle described by Christianity has never truly been about politics, technology, or culture alone. Those are only surface manifestations of something deeper. The real battle is always for the soul, for the human heart, for the question every person eventually faces whether they realize it or not. Will they belong to God, or will they belong to themselves? And according to Christianity, that choice shapes not only this life, but eternity itself. There is a reason the earliest Christians spoke about the world as a battlefield. Not metaphorically, not poetically. They genuinely believed human life unfolded inside an invisible war between truth and deception, light and darkness, grace and rebellion. Modern people hear language like that and immediately assume it belongs to another age, an age of superstition and fear. But the deeper you look at the condition of modern civilization, the harder it becomes to dismiss the possibility that something profoundly spiritual is taking place beneath the surface of ordinary life. Because despite unprecedented wealth, technology, entertainment, and comfort, millions of people are spiritually exhausted. Depression has become normal. Anxiety has become normal. Addiction has become normal. Broken families have become normal. Loneliness has become normal. Even children now carry emotional burdens that previous generations would have considered unimaginable. Humanity has never been more connected digitally, yet so many people feel isolated internally. Never more entertained, yet never more empty. Never more informed, yet never more confused about truth, morality, identity, and purpose. According to many traditional Christian thinkers, this contradiction reveals something important. Human beings were never designed to survive on material fulfillment alone. The soul cannot be satisfied by comfort, distraction, or pleasure, because the soul was created for something eternal. One of the greatest spiritual dangers of modern culture is that it trains people to live as though eternity does not exist. Every system around us pushes attention toward the temporary: work, money, entertainment, politics, appearance, status, consumption. The entire rhythm of modern life keeps people focused on immediate survival and instant gratification, while ignoring deeper spiritual realities. But Christianity teaches that earthly life is incredibly short compared to eternity. Every decision, every habit, every attachment shapes the soul over time. Saints constantly reflect on death, not because they were obsessed with fear, but because they understood clarity. Death strips away illusion. At the end of life, wealth cannot save the soul. Fame cannot save the soul. Technology cannot save the soul. Only truth remains. And according to Christian teaching, the modern world has become extremely skilled at helping people avoid thinking about that reality for as long as possible. This avoidance creates spiritual weakness, because when people stop thinking about eternity, they begin living only for comfort in the present moment. Discipline disappears. Sacrifice disappears. Self-control disappears. Entire societies begin organizing themselves around pleasure and convenience instead of truth and virtue. But comfort has never been capable of producing strong souls. Historically, civilizations grow weak precisely when comfort becomes their highest value. The human person was created for more than consumption. Deep inside every soul exists a longing for meaning, transcendence, beauty, purpose, and communion with God. When that longing is ignored, people instinctively try to fill the emptiness with substitutes. Some chase money endlessly. Others chase relationships, power, entertainment, sexuality, substances, political identity, or personal success. Yet no matter how much they acquire, the emptiness eventually returns because the hunger itself is spiritual. And according to Christianity, only God can satisfy it completely. This is why many traditional priests warn that modern society is not suffering primarily from a political crisis or even a psychological crisis. It is suffering from a crisis of meaning. People no longer know why they exist. They no longer know what human life is for. Once that purpose disappears, confusion spreads everywhere. Morality loses coherence. Relationships lose stability. Identity becomes fragmented, and eventually entire generations begin drifting without direction. The collapse of faith creates a vacuum, and vacuums never remain empty for long. Something always fills them. That is why spiritual confusion often leads people toward counterfeit forms of transcendence. Occultism, radical ideologies, hyper-individualism, and self-created spirituality become attractive because human beings cannot live without believing in something greater than themselves. Even atheistic societies eventually create replacement religions built around politics, identity, pleasure, or ideology. The soul always worships something. Many exorcists and spiritual directors argue that one of the most dangerous lies spreading through modern culture is the belief that evil is merely symbolic. If evil becomes only a metaphor, then sin becomes merely dysfunction. Temptation becomes psychology. The devil becomes mythology. Hell becomes an outdated idea. And once those realities disappear, spiritual vigilance disappears with them. People stop guarding their souls because they no longer believe the soul is truly in danger. Yet Christianity consistently teaches that evil is personal, intelligent, strategic, deceptive. The purpose of evil is not simply to cause suffering, but to separate souls from God. And according to traditional theology, the most successful temptations are usually the ones that appear harmless in the beginning. Pride rarely enters announcing destruction. Lust rarely announces addiction. Despair rarely announces hopelessness. Evil grows gradually through compromise, repetition, and spiritual blindness until the soul becomes trapped without fully understanding how it arrived there. That is why so many saints emphasized vigilance. They examined their consciences daily. They guarded their thoughts carefully. They took temptation seriously, even in small forms, because they understood that spiritual collapse rarely begins dramatically. Modern culture often mocks this level of discipline as extreme, but those saints saw human weakness clearly. They knew how easily pride can disguise itself as confidence, how easily selfishness can disguise itself as self-care, and how easily comfort can slowly replace devotion. The spiritual masters of Christianity constantly warned that the enemy prefers distraction over open confrontation. A distracted soul drifts quietly away from God without resistance. It becomes too busy, too entertained, too exhausted, or too numb to pray deeply, reflect honestly, or confront sin seriously, and perhaps that describes modern civilization better than anything else. Not open hatred of God, but endless distraction from Him. There is also a growing fear among many traditional Christians that humanity is approaching a level of technological control unlike anything seen before in history. Artificial intelligence, surveillance systems, algorithmic manipulation, digital currencies, virtual realities, and biometric technologies are transforming society rapidly. While these innovations may offer practical benefits, many worry about the spiritual consequences of a civilization increasingly detached from physical reality and authentic human connection. Human beings were created for relationship, sacrifice, community, and embodied existence. Yet technology increasingly isolates individuals inside personalized digital worlds designed to manipulate attention and desire continuously. Many people now spend more time interacting with screens than with other human beings. Families sit together physically while remaining emotionally separated by devices. Silence disappears. Reflection disappears. Prayer becomes nearly impossible for minds conditioned to constant stimulation. And when silence disappears, conscience becomes harder to hear. Christianity teaches that God often speaks quietly within the soul through conviction, reflection, and interior awareness. But modern culture trains people to fear silence because silence forces confrontation with reality. In silence, people recognize loneliness. They recognize sin. They recognize fear, purposelessness, regret, and spiritual hunger. Endless entertainment becomes a way of avoiding those confrontations. Yet avoiding truth never heals the soul. It only delays the moment when reality must finally be faced. According to many spiritual directors, modern people are suffering not because they feel too much, but because they rarely stop long enough to understand what they are truly feeling beneath the distractions. One of the clearest signs of spiritual collapse is the growing inability of society to recognize innocence as sacred. Historically, civilizations protected children because children represented purity, vulnerability, and the future itself. But modern culture increasingly exposes children to darkness at younger ages while calling it progress. Violence, pornography, ideological confusion, occult imagery, and moral chaos are introduced early through media, entertainment, and education. Many traditional Christians believe this is not accidental. They argue that corrupting children spiritually weakens future generations before they are even mature enough to defend themselves. A child raised without stability, truth, discipline, prayer, or moral clarity enters adulthood deeply vulnerable to manipulation and despair. And once a generation loses its spiritual roots completely, rebuilding civilization becomes exponentially harder. Yet Christianity insists that even in periods of deep darkness, God continues raising up faithful souls quietly. This pattern appears throughout history repeatedly. During times of corruption and collapse, renewal almost always begins small. A saint in obscurity, a faithful family, a hidden monastery, a courageous priest, a convert searching sincerely for truth. Christianity has never survived because of worldly power alone. It survived because ordinary believers remained faithful even when entire cultures turned against them. That is why many traditional Catholics speak often about the remnant, not as an elite group, but as faithful souls who continue holding to truth when compromise becomes easier. Throughout biblical history, God consistently preserved a remnant during periods of widespread rebellion, and many believe the modern world may be entering another one of those periods now. Still, hope remains central to Christianity, because Christianity is ultimately built upon victory already accomplished through Christ. This is what separates Christian hope from mere optimism. Optimism depends on circumstances improving. Christian hope depends on God remaining sovereign, even when circumstances worsen. According to Christianity, the resurrection of Christ changed history permanently. Evil may still operate in the world, suffering may still exist, darkness may still spread, but none of those realities possess ultimate authority anymore. Death itself was conquered. And because of that, Christians believe no darkness can ever fully destroy the church or erase truth completely. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. That promise has survived empires, persecutions, wars, heresies, scandals, revolutions, and countless attempts to erase Christianity from history. But promises do not eliminate responsibility. Every generation must choose whether it will remain faithful or drift toward destruction. And many traditional Catholic voices believe this generation faces one of the most serious spiritual tests in modern history. Not because suffering itself is new, but because modern civilization has lost the language to understand suffering spiritually. People know how to consume, but not how to endure. They know how to express themselves, but not how to sacrifice. They know how to seek pleasure, but not how to pursue holiness. And without holiness, Christianity becomes little more than cultural identity without transformative power. That is why the call being repeated by so many priests and spiritual teachers today feels so urgent. Return to prayer, return to silence, return to confession, return to discipline, return to reverence, protect your family, guard your soul, learn your faith deeply, take spiritual life seriously before crisis forces you to. Because according to Christianity, every civilization eventually reveals what it truly worships. And whatever a civilization worships ultimately shapes its destiny. There is one truth modern civilization tries harder and harder to avoid every year. Human beings are not self-sufficient. No amount of technology, medicine, psychology, wealth, or political power can remove the deepest hunger inside the human soul. That hunger was placed there intentionally. Christianity teaches that every person was created for communion with God, and when that relationship is broken, everything else in life slowly begins to fracture as well. The reason so many people feel restless today is not simply because the world is chaotic. It is because millions are attempting to live without the very thing they were created for. And the further a civilization drifts from God, the more unstable it becomes internally. You can see it everywhere now. People are surrounded by entertainment but cannot find peace. They have more freedom than any generation before them, yet feel trapped emotionally and spiritually. They can communicate instantly across continents while feeling completely alone in their own homes. Modern culture promised liberation from religion, liberation from moral boundaries, liberation from tradition, liberation from sacrifice. But instead of producing peace, it produced confusion. Instead of freedom, it produced addiction. Instead of happiness, it produced emptiness that no amount of pleasure seems capable of filling. Many traditional Catholic thinkers believe this emptiness is not accidental. It is the direct result of a civilization that has systematically removed God from every major institution shaping human life. Schools teach children how to succeed professionally, but rarely teach them why human life matters at all. Entertainment glorifies pleasure while mocking purity, discipline, and sacrifice. Politics increasingly replaces religion as the primary source of identity and meaning for millions. Even within parts of the church, faith has sometimes been reduced to vague positivity instead of supernatural truth. The result is a generation spiritually starving without fully understanding why. People instinctively know something is missing, but modern society keeps directing them toward temporary distractions instead of eternal answers. And the more disconnected souls become from transcendence, the easier they are to manipulate through fear, desire, anger, and confusion. This is why so many saints throughout history warned that spiritual blindness is far more dangerous than physical suffering. A person can survive poverty, persecution, illness, or hardship and still save their soul. But a person who loses the ability to recognize truth becomes vulnerable in ways far more devastating. According to Christianity, the devil's greatest victory is not convincing people to worship evil openly. It is convincing them that spiritual reality does not matter at all. Once that happens, people stop resisting temptation seriously because they no longer believe eternal consequences exist. Sin becomes normalized, moral boundaries collapse slowly, and eventually entire cultures begin celebrating behaviors that previous generations recognized as destructive. The frightening part is that this transition often happens gradually enough that people barely notice it occurring. Every year the line moves slightly further. Every year another boundary disappears. And because human beings adapt quickly, what once shocked society eventually becomes ordinary. One of the clearest signs of this spiritual collapse is the growing hostility towards silence, prayer, and contemplation. Modern civilization fears silence because silence forces people to confront themselves honestly. In silence, distractions disappear. A person begins noticing the condition of their soul, their fears, their addictions, their unresolved wounds, and the emptiness they spend most of their lives trying to escape. This is why constant stimulation has become so addictive. Phones, social media, endless videos, music, games, and digital entertainment create a barrier against self-reflection. Many people can no longer sit quietly even for a few minutes without reaching for distraction immediately. Yet nearly every saint in Christian history insisted that silence is essential for spiritual clarity. God often speaks quietly. Conscience speaks quietly. Grace moves quietly. But modern life has become so loud that many souls can no longer hear anything beyond the noise. This spiritual numbness becomes especially dangerous during suffering. Christianity teaches that suffering has meaning when united to God. Not because suffering itself is good, but because suffering can purify the soul, expose illusions, deepen humility, and draw a person toward eternal truth. But modern culture rejects suffering completely. Every discomfort must be eliminated immediately. Every emotional wound must be numbed instantly. As a result, many people never develop the spiritual endurance necessary to survive serious trials. The moment hardship arrives, they collapse internally because they were never taught how to suffer with purpose. Previous generations often endured unimaginable hardships while maintaining faith because they viewed suffering through an eternal perspective. Modern society views suffering as meaningless interruption, and without meaning, pain quickly becomes unbearable. This loss of spiritual endurance is one reason many traditional Catholics believe future crises will devastate people psychologically and spiritually. Whether those crises come through economic collapse, social instability, persecution, war, technological control, or deeper moral chaos, the deeper issue remains the same. Souls disconnected from God struggle to endure suffering without despair, and despair is one of the enemy's most powerful weapons. Once people lose hope, they become vulnerable to manipulation, addiction, hatred, and self-destruction. Christianity teaches that hope is not optimism based on circumstances. It is confidence rooted in God Himself. That means even during darkness, Christians believe grace remains present, but a civilization that no longer believes in God loses access to that hope. It begins collapsing inwards spiritually long before physical collapse becomes visible. Many priests involved in spiritual ministry insist that one of the greatest misunderstandings modern people have about evil is believing evil always appears ugly in the beginning. In reality, temptation often appears attractive, liberating, sophisticated, or compassionate at first. Evil rarely introduces itself honestly. It disguises itself as progress, as empowerment, as self-discovery, as freedom from limitations. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Humanity reaches for independence from God, believing it will produce liberation, but instead becomes enslaved by new forms of darkness. Christianity describes this as the consequence of pride, the original sin, the desire to define truth independently from God. And according to traditional theology, pride remains the root of nearly every spiritual collapse. Entire civilizations eventually begin believing they no longer need divine order, moral law, or spiritual authority. That arrogance inevitably produces destruction because human beings were never designed to replace God with themselves. The attack on truth itself has become especially aggressive in modern times. Objective reality is increasingly treated as offensive or oppressive whenever it conflicts with personal desire. But once truth becomes subjective, society loses any stable moral foundation. Every institution begins operating according to power rather than principle. Whoever controls information controls perception. Whoever controls perception shapes reality for millions. This is why many traditional Christians see modern society's war against truth as deeply spiritual, because Christianity teaches that Christ himself is truth. Therefore, confusion, deception, and moral inversion are not merely social problems. They are spiritual attacks against humanity's ability to recognize reality itself. Yet despite this darkness, lost signs of renewal continue appearing quietly beneath the surface. More young people are beginning to question the emptiness of modern secular culture. Many are rediscovering traditional Christianity not because it is easy, but precisely because it demands sacrifice, discipline, reverence, and truth. Young families are returning to older forms of worship, deeper prayer life, homeschooling, sacramental devotion, and intentional community. Converts entering the church often display remarkable seriousness because they arrive through personal searching rather than cultural habit. Many priests describe witnessing a growing divide within society itself. On one side, increasing confusion, moral collapse, and spiritual emptiness. On the other, a smaller but deeply committed remnant seeking truth with extraordinary intensity. This idea of the remnant appears throughout Scripture and church histories repeatedly. God often works through small, faithful communities during periods of widespread corruption. Noah and his family during the flood. Elijah believing he stood alone, while God preserved thousands who remained faithful. The early Christians surviving persecution under Rome. Monasteries preserving civilization after the collapse of the empire. Saints reforming the church during periods of scandal and decay. Christianity has never depended solely on large numbers. It survives through fidelity, through ordinary people remaining faithful in extraordinary times. And many believe that is exactly what this generation is now being called to do. But fidelity requires courage. It requires rejecting the constant pressure to compromise truth for comfort or acceptance. Modern Christians increasingly face a world hostile not only to religious belief, but to the very idea that objective truth exists at all. Standing for truth now often comes with social consequences, professional consequences, even personal isolation. Yet Christianity has always required courage. Christ himself warned his followers repeatedly that faithfulness would bring opposition. The saints were not remembered because they blended into the culture around them. They were remembered because they refused to abandon truth, when abandoning it would have been easier. That is why so many traditional Catholic voices continue repeating the same message with growing urgency. Build strong families now. Teach children clearly now. Pray seriously now. Return to confession now. Strengthen communities now. Learn the faith deeply now. Because when larger crises arrive, shallow faith collapses quickly. Cultural Christianity cannot survive serious pressure. Only conviction can. Only souls rooted deeply in truth endure when the world around them begins losing its mind.